Hey, Snap Flash fam! Botswana is facing some serious economic shifts, and we're diving into the effects of the US imposing a hefty 37% tariff on exports, which is impacting industries like diamonds, beef, and manufacturing. But here's the twist. This might actually be an opportunity for change. Stick around as we break it down. How are the US tariffs shaking up Botswana's economy? Can this crisis be turned into an opportunity? Let's dive into the details. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, hit that like button and subscribe for the latest news, economic insights, and all things impacting Botswana. The Standard Bank Botswana research briefing gathered key players to talk about global risks. And here's what we learned. The 37% tariff on Botswana's exports to the US is hitting hard, especially for industries that rely on international trade. But this isn't the end. It's a call for reinvention.
South Africa, 60%, 30%, and they've got some bad things going on in South Africa. You know, we're paying them billions of dollars, and we cut the funding because a lot of bad things are happening in South Africa. The fake news ought to be looking at it. They don't want to report it. Brazil, 10%, 10%. Bangladesh is 74%. So you see what's going on. Pakistan, 58%.
Diamond exports, beef, and manufacturing are feeling the pinch, but Botswana's government is already taking action to rethink the economic model. Instead of reacting, they're looking at long-term solutions, focusing on reducing public spending inefficiencies, tightening fiscal discipline, and diversifying revenue sources. Despite the challenges, Naledi Madala, senior policy advisor at Botswana's Ministry of Finance, pointed out that Botswana needs to rethink its reliance on traditional revenue sources like diamonds. It's time to think bigger, building a diversified, industrialized economy and strengthening the private sector to take the lead.
I'll tell you what we are thinking about. We have a lot of ideas on the table, but we do realize the importance of starting with just rebuilding the structures, putting the right structures in place. Because I think for us, we do realize that, it doesn't matter how transformational or excellent the strategies that you can come up with are, if you don't have the right environment to be executing those strategies on. So that is why for us, just starting with rebuilding the structures, putting them in place is such a key part of what we are doing. But in terms of the long term, we are thinking of, a lot of work has actually already started. Dr. Said Timono is leading this piece of work where we are putting together work around a sovereign wealth fund, because we have realized that our Pula fund is not technically a sovereign wealth fund, and the minister has actually come back from Europe, where we've gone on to see how other people have done it and done it very well. And I think that is why even the thinking around not just reacting when there's a crisis and saying, I'm cutting spending, is going to allow us that, even in terms of when we are now able to have a surplus, to be able to do very well with this new sovereign wealth fund that we're going to put in place. And this is exactly what the Norwegians have been able to do, use a culture of frugality to actually build sovereign wealth funds and build a lot of wealth for their people. So when you think, the other example that I can give about some of the big benefits that we are thinking about, when you look at, over the years, I think there's been a lot of talk about how our health bill is so significant, but when you look at the nuances of that budget, the health budget, you also realize that we're spending a lot on medical supplies. And the question the way that we approach this is to ask ourselves, but how do you reach a point where you can actually have this medical supplies bill? Yes, this medical supplies procurement. And the way that we are thinking about it is go the precision medicine way. When you have, when you go into precision medicine, medical medicine way, you have the power. When you've been able to put all your people's DNAs in a system, in a infrastructure that is required, you have the power now to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies, to tell them, to give them a real-time feedback to say, hang on, I bought this from you, and this is the output, or this is how it has reacted to person X, person B, person Y. And that way, you are even able, you have power to even negotiate how you are buying those supplies that you are having. So something like that is something that in the future could actually really have or lead to significant savings for the government, but even just for the people themselves, because we find that cancer patients go through so many therapies because no one is sure. But when we are now in the new Botswana and we're talking about precision medicine, then you react with certainty in terms of what to do. So those are some of the things that we are looking at. I think we also spoke about the National Fund of Funds in the budget speech. And this is really a concept where we are saying we have reached a point where the model that the public sector funds has worked, but it has only led us here. It will not take us to the next level. And we are really trying to think creatively about how the public sector funds. We are thinking and asking ourselves, are our DFIs really serving the purpose and serving the needs of the private sector of the day, or they need to be re-looked at? And that is where the concept that we are developing around the National Fund of Funds is coming from. I see that my time is up, but I think I've done well in terms of.
Economists like Razia Khan and Liang Wang shared their thoughts on the broader global shifts that are affecting Botswana. From rising tariffs to slowing global demand and climate change risks, Botswana must adapt to stay competitive on the global stage. Razia Khan, head of research and chief economist for Africa and the Middle East at Standard Chartered Bank, highlighted the broader macroeconomic risks facing Botswana and the region. She noted that while global economies have shown resilience, rising tariffs, slowing consumer demand, especially in China, and climate change-related risks are reshaping the economic landscape.
The reset of the global environment and international relations makes many European countries realize that they've got to take on board the responsibility for their own defense spending. So the changes made to Germany's debt brake, the further fiscal changes that we think we'll see that will allow for greater spending on defense in Europe could finally be the trigger for something that brings about an economic turnaround in Europe. If we do see much more fiscal stimulus being announced elsewhere, and this is still uncertain for now, then the downsides to global growth could just be protected. But it's very difficult to make any sweeping comments just yet because we're too early in this process. We don't know if there will be automatic retaliatory tariffs elsewhere. If that is the case, the implications for global growth are going to be even more significant. So let me leave that discussion there. It's a long way of saying something big happened last night. Markets had completely miscalculated the likelihood of this announcement coming through. Economists are very uncertain about the impact that all of this will have on global growth. But we know that it's not a screaming positive. We can look for the silver lining. We could say China doing more to stimulate domestic demand, to rebalance its economy is a good thing. And in the long term, this could be good for Botswana. It probably is better for emerging market growth on the whole. Europe, a key trading partner for Africa, maybe being able to reignite growth through greater defense spending initially, but we will see the revival of industry and manufacturing in Europe. That's no bad thing for the global economy either. That could eventually be a good thing. The problem, the challenge facing economies like Botswana is that in the near term, the difficulties are compounded. I wish I could stand before you today and not look like an economist who got too little sleep last night, but there were good reasons for getting too little sleep. So let's talk about the outlook for Botswana's economy. We already know, for what was unquestionably, historically, Africa's most successful economy, that recent years have been very challenging. Botswana hasn't for a while been the growth outperformer, hasn't been close to it for some time. That overdependence on mining, the weaknesses associated with this have really come to the fore. We see it in the scale of the fiscal deficit in the current the last fiscal year 25, likely to be 9% of GDP, We see it in the deterioration of external balances because of the weakness of global diamond demand. And there is nothing out there, nothing on the immediate horizon, with US consumers, usually the consumer of the last resort on a global scale, having to be hit by all of these tariffs. It's not looking very good for the global diamond demand outlook at all. It's a very sobering factor. We're going to need a lot more time to look at the full implications of this for global growth, the full implications of this for global diamond demand, but there's no reason to think that any of this is going to be a near-term positive. And what it does mean is that Botswana is going to face even more challenging times potentially, to the extent that there was stresses in the system because of the reduction in mining-related revenue. Let's not think that that is going to come back anytime soon. We know about recent ratings action facing Botswana. We know about the S&P change to the outlook of Botswana's rating from stable to negative. Moody's comes out with its own rating in the near term. And there's a very real likelihood that Botswana could be downgraded because of the reduction in both external and fiscal buffers. So the question we should be asking ourselves, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot of this from our esteemed panel, is what should Botswana be doing to reset? We know that there has to be a way out of these deep fiscal deficits, that it's not really an option for any country to run deficit after deficit, to erode the savings buffers that had been built up over time. There's been a substantial amount of that already. What should the immediate priority for Botswana be? And how do you cope with all of that when the domestic economy, the non-mining economy, which had largely held up to offset the impact of the mining contraction seen last year, is now at risk because of the electricity situation? We know that the challenges will be vast. Maybe just very briefly outlining the key things that needs to be done. First of all, when faced with this uncertainty, there's a policy prescription that's very important for all countries. And that is, do not be too reactive in terms of what you do. Botswana has been through past crises. The 2009 financial crisis, when mines had to be shut down for a period of 4 months, no one imagined that something like that could even be possible. There had been no forward planning for an event like that. The recency of the COVID crisis, where once again global demand collapsed, and now the threat faced not only by lab diamonds, making up 20% of the global diamond market already, albeit at a discount to real diamonds, but also the geopolitics and how quickly we might be seeing rehabilitation of Russia. So the policy prescription that economists would make is, we know Botswana has weathered crises in the past, but it's never really been able to emerge as strong as it was before that crisis happened. This is the time to really step up and not allow the crisis to go to waste. So if we were to reflect on Botswana's economic history, yes, there had been a great deal of past success, but a great deal of conservatism underscoring that, which may have impeded the diversification of the economy. Now there is a government in place that fully recognizes the necessity of accelerating that diversification process. It's no longer going to be possible for government to do everything on its own. There will have to be private sector participation. And perhaps the greatest opportunity that Botswana will face in all of this, it's looking like a very difficult, challenging, near-term environment ahead, is to be firm about what it wants to achieve in the longer term. Be clear about those objectives. With every policy decision that is being taken, the question that should be asked is, how is this lending itself to long-term diversification of the economy? How is this lending itself to long-term competitive strengthening? And if it doesn't meet the test of diversification, there needs to be serious question marks around whether that is the right policy objective.
On the international stage, Liang Wang, resident representative of the World Bank for Botswana, provided insights on how Botswana can navigate these global uncertainties. He stressed the importance of building a more diversified, industrialized economy, fostering private sector growth to reduce dependence on government-led economic activity, and strengthening financial management practices to ensure long-term sustainability.
I think I'm going to use your headline message is how do we use the opportunities to reset. My colleagues and some of you in the audience, especially my finance ministry friends, have heard me repeatedly saying about this thing about thinking productivity. And I would add today that think productivity and think the long term. I do think Botswana needs to think through what's going to happen beyond the current cycle. Especially there's going to be a lot of time of waiting and waiting to see how things settle. The reason I mention the productivity is, the Botswana growth story, I think everybody understands, but the growth has been slowing down over the past 2 to 3 decades, right? But in the first 30 years of Botswana's independence, Botswana was growing at 7%. In the early 2000s to 2000s, Botswana was growing on average at 5% a year. After 2010, Botswana was growing at 3% a year. But then if you look deeper into the productivity growth, Botswana's productivity has actually been contracting around 1.6% a year over the past decade. What does that mean? That means for the same amount of inputs, Botswana was producing less in terms of its financial resources, in terms of its natural resources, in terms of its human resources. So for Botswana to continue to grow, that growth has to be led by productivity. There's quite a debate in Botswana says, this is public sector-led economy. Should we really introduce more private sector-led economy? But for me, taking that ideological debate element away, use productivity-led growth, and that should be really the lens how policymakers, how people in the country think about the growth strategies, both in terms of country and also as individuals, as firms. Now, of course, all the countries have investments, have budgets designed for social purposes, and rightfully so. For Botswana as a country, there's still a lot of poverty, lots of inequality that require more socially oriented interventions. But for economy, for budget as a whole, if that does not give you that kind of productivity, that elements, then you will not expect your budget. You should not expect your budget to deliver the kind of growth you will get into because you know the inputs are not going to the most productive areas. So that's my point number one. The point number two, macro fundamentals. Now, this is not something we usually associate Botswana with in the past, but I think that's really an important point at this particular moment. And I do want to talk about fiscal consolidation a little bit. I think that the Vice President and Minister of Finance was very explicit in the budget speech when he spoke about stopping the financial hemorrhage. And that has to be done. That needs to be done. Botswana doesn't have the fiscal buffer it used to have. And after hearing all the global uncertainties, boy, don't you wish you have a little more money in the GIA account to cope with what may be coming in the coming year. 10% of deficit is too high, and especially for a relatively small economy and quite a vulnerable economy to external shocks. When you don't have a buffer, I'm sure my finance ministry colleagues don't sleep very well at night. So how do you do that? I think that's very difficult, especially when the overall economic situation is not in a positive territory. So I'm sure my friend Naledi will speak a little bit more with the government in the plans. But I want to mention one thing, which is the spirit of. Well, let me say this. Every time I go to UB, University of Botswana, I was reminded how UB was built. There's a Botswana sentence for it, but in English it's called one man, one cattle. Now, when people talk about fiscal or consolidation, the tendency is always, you should consolidate the other person's budget, not mine. And that's not how it's going to work. Fiscal consolidation requires leadership, but also requires a very collective effort. And I really think this is a moment the whole government, the whole economy, the whole society needs to rally. I think Botswana is in a unknown territory that Botswana has never been to before. I think Razia talked about the global financial crisis and the COVID crisis, how Botswana recovered. Maybe I should say, maybe this time is different. I don't really know, nobody really knows. But I think it's because nobody knows. I think that gives everybody the nervousness of what's going to happen. And I really think this is the time there needs to be that collective spirit to weather the difficult situation together. Finally, let me just add, just to say that the point of how do you promote productivity growth. There is actually a set of principles how countries do that. You do need macro and fiscal stability. You need a lot of innovation and really change the way of doing things. Again, I think going beyond the short-term difficulties and be proactive, looking for opportunities in the longer term. I think energy sector, Razia spoke about, that's a good example of how not to be reactive to the short-term crisis and think beyond the medium and longer term and really put Botswana on a competitive advantage. A lot of focus on education. Botswana's human capital base is low compared to other middle-income countries. For Botswana to grow towards high-income countries, Botswana needs a much more stronger human capital base that's more responsive to the market. A lot of infrastructure needs to be done, but infrastructure is no longer the traditional infrastructure. It is a new infrastructure. It is the digital connectivity. I think that's a lot of areas. Actually, I was reading the other night, Estonia rolled out e-government in a massive way after the global financial crisis. I think that's the kind of opportunity Botswana can leverage. And finally, public sector efficiency and performance. I think Botswana has a very large public sector, but how do you make sure the public sector uses the opportunity to change it, to be more efficient, to be more proactive in policy making and policy execution? I think those are really important elements to propel Botswana towards a longer term, towards a productivity-led growth. Thank you so much.
It's not all doom and gloom. Experts at the event called for innovation and new trade partnerships to help Botswana thrive. By embracing change, exploring new industries, and strengthening regional collaboration, Botswana has the chance to turn these economic challenges into growth opportunities. So, what's next for Botswana? The US tariffs may be a tough pill to swallow, but this could be the wake-up call that leads to positive change. We're talking about a future where Botswana moves beyond diamonds and explores new economic avenues. Stay tuned for more updates on how Botswana is navigating these economic changes. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you don't want to miss this story unfold. This is Snap Flash, where the biggest stories get the spotlight. Keep questioning and stay informed.